Hi, my name is Mike Beamish, and I live here with my wife Carol, and we own and operate Beamish Orchard. And recently we've expanded to Deep Roots Distillery. So we planted our apple orchard in 1990, and both my wife and I grew up in the city. So we didn't come from a farming background. When we moved here, when we started this hobby farm, it was from scratch. We had to learn everything. So it's been quite an experience, but we learned a lot about apples, growing apples. And an interesting fact is that with most fruits and vegetables, we know that if we have a nice one growing, like we have a nice pumpkin patch and we have a nice beautiful pumpkin in there, and we want to get more pumpkins next year with those same characteristics, we would take that pumpkin and take its seeds, plant them next year, and we would get similar pumpkins. Well, what we found out is apples don't work that way. You take the seed from a Honeycrisp apple and you plant it. Well, that seed will grow into a tree, but it probably will not produce a Honeycrisp apple. 1 in a million, it just might by chance, but genetics say that it won't. It'll make either a little crab apple, maybe no apples, or green apple. There's no continuity through the seed of the apple into the variety. The only way to create an apple tree to make a specific variety of apple, I'd go to this tree next spring, and I would cut a piece of branch, and so like this, and as long as I'm exposing, I don't know if you can get a nice close-up there, but right on the side of the bark, if anybody remembers from your grade 12 biology class, right underneath the bark is a cambium layer, and that's where the growth cells are for the tree. And so that we know this branch came from a tree that has produced Honeycrisp apples. So then we would have grown another tree from roots, and in the spring we would go to that tree and we would pretend that's out of the ground, and we would do a nice slice like that, and a slice on this one. Now there's many methods to do this. This is just one, a simple one to explain. And you would put them together, ensuring that the cambium layer on both of those is touching. So be lining them up, and then put a nice elastic or something around it to keep them tight, and that's grafting. And that will go into one single tree. So that is where the graft was done. So this tree grew from roots, and they cut it off, and they grafted this one on top of it. So this is a variety of apple. So another interesting thing we learned about the apple trees is that the tree actually gets ready to make its fruit a year early. All summer, this branch has been growing. A new leaf would come, branch longer, another leaf, and so on. Well, now the tree, by its nature, says it's time to prepare for winter and for next year. So it puts a bud at the end of the branch, and when it puts that bud there, there's no more growth this year. It puts buds along the branch, which next year will become leaves and branches. So you can see right here, and I can tell that's a fruit bud because it's on like a little short branch. They call that a spur. And that little bud is actually going to be bigger than the other ones. If you come back here in November after the leaves have fallen, you'll see those small little buds that are going to make leaves and branches next year. And you'll see these fruit buds, and they'll be quite a bit bigger, and they'll kind of stick straight out. And they're the fruit buds. And they're going to stay on the tree all winter, we hope. And every fruit bud in the spring is going to grow into 5 blossoms. And each of those blossoms has the potential to be an apple. They all get pollinated, where you could have 5 apples out of one little blossom. You could get this sort of situation, where that's a lot of apples in one little spot on the tree. And you know, the tree has a certain root size, structure, and a certain amount of leaves it can produce to generate the food. So if I have a lot of apples like this, you can see lots, well, they're all competing for the limited amount of food that's available. If there was one apple here, one there, they would get bigger, they would get a better color. And I retired about 8 years ago, and we were looking for something different to do, and also something to use up a lot of our ground apples. In the fall, you get a bit of a windy day and the apples are ripe. They come off the tree quite easy. And there's a health regulation in all of North America, in fact, that we, as a business, we're not supposed to use apples off the ground to make juice unless we pasteurize it. And the problem is a pasteurizer is very expensive. And so it means all those apples that fall to the ground for me were waste. and had to go into the compost pile. So it was always kind of rolling around the back of my head that I had to find some use for those apples instead of throwing them out into the compost. If you collect them every day before the bugs get to them, 70% of those apples are fine. Just by chance, one night I was reading something and it said if you ferment and distill your juice, you can use ground apples with no problem. And the key is if you're going to ferment and distill, because alcohol at a 17% and higher kills bacteria. And that's the issue. Apple falls to the ground, picks up E. coli or some other bacteria. You make juice, people drink it and they get sick. When you ferment the apple juice and distill it to make a high percentage alcohol, the alcohol by its nature kills bacteria. So what we do now is we'll come out and collect our apples and we'll pick off the tree, and if we happen to find some good ones on the ground that haven't been eaten by bugs or not bruised or not damaged whatsoever. So we collect our apples, we crush them to make a juice, we ferment the juice. So we put that fermented apple juice into a still, which is basically a pot that we can heat and control the escape of the steam. So we put the heat to the pot, and when the temperature gets to about 78 degrees Celsius, water boils at 100. But alcohol boils at 78. So when it gets to 78, the alcohol components of that fermented cider turns to steam, starts to evaporate. And we're collecting that steam in a copper head and condensing it back to a liquid. And that's how we're extracting the alcohol out of the fermented product. So once we get that out of our apple cider, we then age it in barrels like these. Those are 60-liter Hungarian oak barrels that we select. And we age it for 2 years. And that's where the alcohol, that's where the brandy gets its color, and it gets some of its smoothness and also some extra flavor from the wood. That's our apple brandy.